Good morning, Resonate family. Welcome to the second week of our house-to-house gatherings. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and make your way to the book of Habakkuk. That's where we are going to be this morning. And what I believe is a timely word just to kind of understand the moment we are in and then how God brings renewal and revival to his people. Hope you are all doing well, connecting with one another, adjusting to new patterns of life. I hope you're reaching out as you are able, and praise God for the sunshine the other day. Before we begin, I just want to take about 60 seconds and do some listening prayer. We do this each week, and we just want to make space to ask, Lord, what do you want to say to me today? So take about 60 seconds, take a deep breath, and then ask the Lord, what do you want me to hear from you today, Lord? Just take 60 seconds and do that. Lord Jesus, would you be with us during this time today? Help us to know you more fully and experience your presence. Lord, help us to see that, Lord, you are indeed at work in the time that we live in. Help us as your church to live faithfully in this age. It's for the fame, for the glory of Christ that we ask all these things in your name. Amen. In his book titled Reappearing Church, which was released sometime last year, Mark Sayers says the following: "The secularist life script in which humans attempt to live without having to confront the great questions of life, the questions of life create insulation against the faith. However, this insulation is not as secure as it may seem. For example, during the 2008 financial crisis, the global banking system came terribly close to a worldwide Great Depression, which would have fundamentally changed the kind of lives that we live today." He goes on to say, if a major war broke out between the great powers of the world, such as Russia or China or India or the US or other NATO forces, a threat that he says many experts agree is actually increasing, he says our lives would be radically altered. Check this one out. He says, if we endured a global flu pandemic like the one in the early part of the 20th century that killed millions of people across the world, how we view and process personal potentials and possibilities would be deeply shaken. We feel some of that right now. He goes on to say, imagine if North Korea launched a devastating cyber attack that disabled most or large parts of the world's internet for months or even years. He says, think about how different your life would be. Consider how you would have to readjust your life and how you access community and how you access relationships. Sayers says in Australia, where he pastors a church, after the 9/11 attacks against America, church attendance skyrocketed in his country, all the way on the other side of the globe. The reason he gives is this. He says the secularist bubble of radical individualism and hyper-consumerism was pierced. And for a brief time, the mythology that it is possible to live a life without God was rattled. And when that narrative was rattled, people responded. We saw this here in the U.S. on a global scale. And if you're old enough, you likely know people whose stories are this is the place after the 9/11 attacks where people came to faith. Sayers goes on to say, your life, your freedom, your approach to faith and meaning are shaped by large-scale factors. Factors that, as we heard last week, are very much out of your control. And very much that we assume these factors to be stable and secure, and in reality can and do change suddenly and with almost zero notice. Now think about that for a second. Pause and think about that. Because there is zero doubt that every single one of us is feeling the weight of this reality right now. The disruption, the change, the isolation, the loneliness, the fear, the loss of income or the fear of loss of income, sickness, death, fear of the unknown, that any of or all these things may happen to us or a loved one. This is our new reality. We don't know how long, but this is the new reality. And here's our hope, that God's promise that He gives us in moments just like this, the moment we're in, God will bring renewal to His people, and He will bring, and through His people, bring revival to His world. If you've been around Resonate any length of time, you have likely heard me or someone else quote this verse. The knowledge of the glory of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. In this verse, God is using a word picture to promise that there will be a time when every place will be saturated with the glory of God. The illustration here is vivid. So if you imagine waters covering the sea, the picture that I always get, and you know this, is that every nook and cranny is soaked. There is no place where the knowledge of God's glory is not present and experiential and real. This is a promise of renewal and revival that God gives to a people during a time of immense suffering and upheaval and chaos and destruction. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to lay this verse, Habakkuk 2:14, in its intended context, in its original context, and explain why this verse is so very important to us as a church and how we live in all times, but even especially during the moment that we're in now. Let's begin with Habakkuk chapter 1 in verse 2. Prophet Habakkuk writes, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence, and you do not save? Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. This is why the law is ineffective and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted." Now, the landscape of Habakkuk's world is being dominated by a ruthless world superpower called the Assyrians. And so for several years, life for God's people had been filled with war, hunger, and poverty, and fear, death at the hands of the Assyrians. And in verses 2 and 3, in the midst of all this suffering that they're experiencing, Habakkuk the prophet, he cries out to God two questions that may sound eerily familiar to you right now in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Habakkuk asks two questions. Basically, he says, how long? And he asks, why? Essentially, Habakkuk wants to know where God is in all this heartache and pain. He cries out, "Where are you, God, in the midst of this violence that's going on? Where are you, God, where this iniquity is all over the place? Where are you in the midst of strife and contention? Where are you when your law seems to be paralyzed? Where are you when there is no justice and justice is perverted?" Basically, the wrong things are being portrayed as being the right things, and the right things are being portrayed as being the wrong things. Habakkuk says, God, these Assyrians are surrounding your people, and you are doing nothing about it. You don't even hear me. How long will you ignore me? Why is this happening, and where are you? Can you imagine watching the prophet Habakkuk pray this prayer of lament? What I love is that he is giving us an example of what we talked about last week, about what we've been talking about, showing up with our emotions. He's showing up and he's being present with God in his suffering. He's making space to seek God's presence and to look, and you can look at this however you like. The things that Habakkuk is saying to God are things that he himself know to be true about the promise and the character and the power of God. All of the work that we are doing and talking about being human comes into focus when we look at Habakkuk crying out to God. He's crying out to God, and he's crying out for God in his lament. He's saying, help. He's saying, I can't do this. He's saying, these things are out of my control. Think about if Habakkuk had a feelings chart in front of him and what he may be feeling. Let's continue reading on to see how God responds to him. Verse 5 says this, look at the nations and observe. Be utterly astounded, for I am doing something in your days that you will not believe when you hear about it. Look, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter, impetuous nation that marches across the earth's open space and seizes territory that's not its own. They are fierce and terrifying. Their views of justice and sovereignty stem from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than wolves of the night. Their horsemen charge ahead. Their horsemen come from distant lands. They fly like eagles, swooping to devour. All of them come to do violence. Their faces are set in determination. They gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings, and rulers are a joke to them. They laugh at every fortress and build siege ramps to capture it. Then they sweep by like the wind and pass through. They are guilty. Their strength is their God. First of all, before we get into what God said in his response, let me just say this. Can you see how gracious the Father is here in his willingness to even respond to Habakkuk? Now, the response that God gives Habakkuk is certainly not what Habakkuk was looking for. In fact, we'll read in just a moment how what God was saying was so unbelievable that basically Habakkuk says, there is no way that you would do something like this, God. The something that the prophet can't wrap his mind around is the fact that God basically responds with this: things are not going to get better anytime soon from your perspective, Habakkuk. He says, in fact, I'm going to raise up another group of pagans called the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And while you're dealing with this thing with the Assyrians, the Babylonians are going to be raised up, and they are going to be far more fierce than the Assyrians ever thought about being. And they're going to do far more damage than the Assyrians ever thought about doing. He says, I'm going to use this enemy army to carry out my plans. In verses 5 and 6, this is not some doily verse that's crocheted on an Afghan or put on a wall. This is a gut-wrenching verse where God says, what I am up to is going to leave you astonished. He says, I'm telling you now what I'm doing, because when it actually happens, you are still going to have trouble believing that this is actually God at work. And this is where I feel most of us are today. In one way, shape, form, or fashion. We're trying to wrap our minds around how in the world, how in the world global pandemics, tornadoes, economic meltdown, and isolation could actually be a way that God is going to cause his name to be great and humanity to flourish. This feeling is why I believe the Bible gives us what we see embodied in Habakkuk, this biblical language called lament. You see, we grieve the suffering in the world. And this is what I call funeral mentality. But see, at a funeral for a loved one, what happens is we are forced to look at the reality that death comes to every single person. At a funeral, we're forced to stop. At a funeral, we're forced to change plans, to see people that maybe we wouldn't normally see, to weep when we normally wouldn't weep, to tell stories of the past. No human being has ever attended a funeral for a loved one and not had the thought that death and suffering just seems so wrong and so invasive. Every single human being, regardless of color, regardless of religion, regardless of socioeconomic status, every human being feels that. Every human knows that. And in these moments, we're invited by God to express the sorrow in the pain and the lament that things in some ways will never be the same again, and that we need God to fix it. After God tells Habakkuk that things are going to get crazier, and it's true, no one in all Judah or Israel would have fathomed that God would allow a foreign army to be raised up and devastate and deport his people from the promised land, to literally wipe out the temple, the center of worship, and the place where the presence of God dwelled, and people experienced the presence of God. Nobody would have fathomed that would have been what God was going to do. No one would have dreamed that in a million years, that God would work in that way for his glory. How would God allow evil to prevail over good? Is this not out of the character of God? And so here's what we have to do. Again, these are valid questions to ask. Who is God showing us that he is? This is the fight that we see Habakkuk enter into. And just to be clear, you can read the rest of chapter 1. Habakkuk does not like the fact that God said this. It stinks. He knows that people are going to be hurt. He knows that people are going to be uprooted. He knows that people are going to be killed. And this is a gut-wrenching reality for him that's on the way, because there's been so much devastation already. And it should be, because death and brokenness and destruction is never easy. And this is challenging stuff for our faith. It's hard stuff for our faith. And it's hard stuff for people who are in our communities, who are looking for hope to connect this. Anyone who's ever been through any of those things can tell you how difficult it is. Here's what really stinks, but it's the truth. 1 year from today, some people who are listening to this video and tape will likely feel some of the pain in a different way, because things would have happened, life would have happened to you. And a year from now, you're going to experience and know things about the depth of suffering that you didn't know today. Even the thought of that shakes me to my core. And it should shake you as well. When Habakkuk received this response from God, he didn't like skip away and put on a happy face. I imagine that he was horrified. I imagine that he was angry. I imagine that he wept bitterly. And in and through this, Habakkuk entered this struggle of seeking to reconcile the truth about who God is. And in doing that, he's drawing on his past. He's drawing on what God has said about himself and how he's revealed. I can just picture Habakkuk sitting down and saying, I can't believe what I've just heard from God. He's good, right? How do I know he's good? He's just, right? How do I know that he brings perfect justice? These answers are not always immediate. Sometimes these are the absolute last things that we want to ask or have someone ask us. And our tendency in all this, I fear, is that we run away. Habakkuk's initial response is to say, what the heck? How could you do this? I can't believe it. Based on everything I know about the righteousness of God, I refuse to believe that you are doing this to us. You're going to do this to us. Beginning of chapter 2, Habakkuk, it's almost like he's like a petulant child. He's almost as if you read those chapters, he says, okay, you're saying all this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go up in the watchtower and I'm just going to call you on it. I'm going to wait and just watch and see what you do. And God responds again with these words. He says, Habakkuk, I want you to be sure to write this down, because you're going to want to look at it later. I want you to write this down. And in verses 2:20, God says, you can be assured that the wicked will be punished at the right time. The timing may not line up with your timing, Habakkuk, but you can be assured that everything will happen at the right time. And then we have this verse where God says all this devastation is going to happen, and there's this promise set in the middle of all of these verses. Habakkuk 2:14 is God saying, I know how hard this is. It's a lot to wrap your mind around and even more to experience. But here's my promise in all this. I'm filling the earth with the knowledge of my glory as the waters cover the sea. Through all of these terrible things, cry out, yes. Grieve, yes. Lament, yes. And most certainly trust that I am at work and my presence is with you. Above all, be a people of hope. You see, all of this may not happen. The life may not happen in the way that we expect it to happen, but God has always worked that way. Think about the places in the story where this is true. Reflect on the places in your own life where this is true, where you believe to have a plan all worked out, and that plan was devastated, and you grieved deeply over that. But then God met you in another place to show you exactly how He was working in and through that grief and devastation. So we move to chapter 3. I'm under no impression that what comes next here was this immediate response of Habakkuk. I'm willing to bet that this is a place where, like this prayer that he's about to pray, is so difficult given the circumstances. But I can't help but see it as a cry for hope, to desire God to do what He has promised in Habakkuk 2:14, to bring renewal, to bring revival. Listen to these words. Habakkuk falls on his knees and he says, Lord, I have heard the report about you. Lord, I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years. Make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk says, I've heard the report about you. I'm reminding myself of the story. I'm looking back at my parents and my parents before me and the story of God and these symbols that are behind me. This story, I'm reminding myself at how you always work for my good and for your glory. And I'm meditating and diving into your word to remember what is true about you. And I'm seeking to know you more deeply during this time and experience you more fully. He says, I stand in awe of your deeds. And he says, if all of this is true, Lord, if you can bring glory, your glory, and human flourishing out of utter devastation, he said, if you can do that, then I'm fully in awe of you. And this picture of awe is worship in what God has done and what He's doing. He says, revive your work in these years and make it known in these years. And what Habakkuk is showing us in these 3 short chapters is this sort of structure of him saying, Lord, start this renewal work with me. Start this revival work with me. Bring renewal to my heart and soul during my time of suffering and questioning and lament. He's saying in his crying out to God, asking how long and why, he's saying, Lord, I want you to be near to me. I want to hear you. I desire to stay near to you. He's saying, do this renewal work right here, right now, in this place and in this time, and allow me to go forward and walk, Lord, with this sorrowful spirit because the world is broken, but this rejoicing spirit knowing that you are at work. And finally, he says, in your wrath, remember mercy. The wrath of God, family, has been satisfied in the person and work of Jesus. But here, what I believe Habakkuk, I think, is saying is that as things begin to get worse, as we begin to feel the threat of the Babylonians breathing down our necks, as we begin to feel all the weight and experience these things that you're saying are coming, he's saying, Lord, I just ask you that you would be merciful. Lord, be merciful there. In the midst of our present suffering, what if we were to establish practices that made prayers like this one of our new normals? Well, I think it's exactly what Habakkuk committed himself to. Because the book ends, and you need to know this, the book ends and things don't magically get better. Listen to how Habakkuk ends. Final verses of chapter 3. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though the flocks disappear from the pen, and there are no herds in the stall, yet I will celebrate in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord, my Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like those of a deer and enables me to walk on mountain heights. Habakkuk is a man who dared to show up with God, to cry out and lament, to ask questions, to seek his presence. And during a terrible period of suffering, even when the threat of suffering was going to increase exponentially, he shows us what it looks like to not only survive, but to thrive, to be renewed by God, and to celebrate in the Lord, to dare to believe that in this time, in this place, God's promise is still true. Family, in this time and in this place, God's promise is still true. He will fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory as the waters cover the sea. Chapter 2, verse 4, Habakkuk 2:14 is a call to remember that God will do what he has always promised that he would do. When we find ourselves in circumstances where our plans are shaken and have to be changed, believing God's promise means that we have to grieve that our ways and our plans have to be changed, and they failed. That's where we are today. None of us ever dreamed that we would be doing church in our homes and not be able to meet in our buildings because of virus. Like Habakkuk, if we would simply allow ourselves to enter into the presence of God with our lament, if we need to lament, with our celebration, if we need to celebrate, with whatever that is, if we just need to ask God, how long? If we need to ask God, why are you doing this? Don't you see us? That's a place where he will meet us. When our dream or vision for life enters into less than spectacular circumstances, like where we are, and we're reminded at the life of Jesus that we recognize that he went first. And family, as followers of Jesus, we practice his way. God was doing something in Christ that no one would have ever dreamed or thought of or believed. No one would have ever believed that God would use both the Romans and the Hebrew people, that these two groups would actually combine forces and unleash their anger and vitriol against the King of the universe. What God was speaking of as being astounding in chapter 1, he certainly meant it for the immediate context of the Babylonians. But even more so, what I believe is that's an ultimate promise that God was giving. And I believe what he's saying is what ultimately we're going to look at and be astonished by is the fact that the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, lowered himself to be crucified on the cross. God died for sinners. Christ died for you, which is our ultimate hope, family, in this time, that God entered into flesh and bone and became person Jesus and willingly submitted himself to being exiled and broken and bruised and battered and murdered on a Roman cross. Man, the Jesus way is a way that is so unprecedented. But it's the way that promises that the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will fill all in all. And family, that is good news for us. And it's good news for our city, especially in the time that we are in right now. Family, may we be renewed by this promise today as we seek to practice the way of Jesus together. Take some time to discuss the questions in your digital liturgy.